Okay, this is Emily Hauser. Sorry for the problem with the audio. In order to have us all hear each other, I unmuted everyone, so could you please mute your phones? Do not put it on, don't put your phone on hold, because I'm already hearing a lot of feedback.
Thanks, Emily.
You're welcome. Ido, are you there? Unmute your phone and say hello. And Stuart, are you there? Okay, we're going to go ahead and start. Again, Dan's going to speak. We're going to start right back where all right. Dan, you can start.
Okay. I'll be brief. Try to catch up here a little bit. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Hudson River Estuary, it is best described as a rock-framed estuary, very fjord-like, deep water, the shorelines themselves are fairly hard with bedrock. It runs due north-south from New York City. The photo there you'll see is western Long Island, about 152 miles up to the Troy, or the federal lock at Troy. It is tidal for that entire length, about 5-foot tides at Troy. Most of the estuary itself is fresh water. If you look at the map there, the southern third of it, there's a sort of a widening of the river just below West Point. That's Haverstraw Bay. That's about the extent of detectable salt on most days. Because it's a freshwater tidal estuary, we have that's something to keep in mind. It's because because of our colder climates in the winter, we deal a lot with a lot of ice on our shorelines, which is the predominant energy force that causes erosion or disruption of our shoreline environments. Quick fact about the Hudson itself that I like to remind people about is that it's the only sea level rise crossing of the Appalachian chain of mountains. So if you think about that for a moment, it will help explain a lot about the history of the river and its present day use. It's got a long industrial history and agricultural history. And that's about all I'm going to say about the Hudson itself. So welcome to the Hudson, and hope you enjoy what we have to say about it today.
Thank you, Dan. And now Casey Giuliani from the CEC Hudson River Estuary Program is going to continue to talk about an inventory. Thank you, Casey.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about a project that Dan and I worked on this year where we looked at hardened shoreline on the Hudson River and we created an inventory. So the idea here was we wanted to look at or identify the low-hanging fruit sites where we could do demonstration projects for the Sustainable Shorelines project. So we were looking at sites that were hardened in some way and would likely require maintenance within the next 5 to 10 years. So this project really began in 2005 when Dan Miller and Chris Bowser went out and they looked at all of the Hudson River shoreline from the Tappan Zee north to the Troy Dam, and they classified the shoreline by type. So the photo that you'll see here is a screenshot taken in ArcMap, and the colors, the different colors you see along the shoreline indicate different shoreline types. So, for example, the blue color, how can I get to a pointer?
Right here, right there, right there. And then this is an arrow.
Okay. if you guys can see, do I have to click or? If you can see the arrow there, that blue color indicates revetment, and so the railroad runs up along the shoreline there, and so this was the inventory that was done in 2005. And this was the results of that inventory. They determined that about 41% of the Hudson River shoreline from the Tappan Zee to Troy is hardened in some way. And then under the blue arrow, you see how that's broken down. And about 29% of the total shoreline is railroad, which would be part of the revetment here. So the project that we did this year was kind of a continuation where we gathered more information on the hardened shoreline. We looked at sites that would need some type of shoreline work done in the near future, and we were focusing on built or developed shorelines, and we looked at, for the prioritization part, their use and the condition of the shoreline itself. So in terms of data collection, we used a few different tools. The NOAA Environmental Sensitivity Index, we used a layer that we had created using their information that identified where the hardened shoreline was. So when we went out in our boat, it was easier for us to identify what was hardened because we could just look at our GPS, and we already had the layer on there to show us where the hardened shoreline was. We also used, so the GPS that we used was a Leica Xeno 5 handheld data logger. It made it a lot easier for us to collect information. It also takes pictures, so the photos that we took were already geo-referenced to the points that we marked on the map. And then we used a rangefinder as well for some measurements. So this is an example of the attribute information that we collected. It's sort of a variety of different pieces of information. We looked at some measurements, so the distance from the shoreline to the main navigational channel. We looked at the distance from 2 meters depth to the shoreline. We measured the distance from the target shoreline that we were looking at to the opposite shoreline to give us an idea of what the energy was like at that particular site. Whether or not there was infrastructure present or absent, the condition of the shoreline itself, we broke down into 3 categories, pristine, maintenance required, or failing. And then we also classified the adjacent land use, so whether it was a marina or municipally owned or a park, residential. And then the depth of the shoreline, so whether it was if it was a vertical shoreline, obviously it would be like 3 feet or 4 feet. And then if it was a sloping shoreline, we classified it as 0. And then we looked at whether or not there was shoreline vegetation present, SAV present. And I should just note that some of the information here we didn't collect in the field. We did some post-processing of our data. So the SAV in particular, we used the Hudson River Estuary SAV maps to identify whether there had ever been SAV present at that particular location. We didn't visit every shoreline site during the growing season for SAV, so we weren't able to collect data on that in the field. And then we also were able to take a picture, as I mentioned. So when it came down to the actual prioritization part of the project, we went back and forth on how involved we should get with that, and we decided ultimately to go with a pretty simple prioritization system. So the picture here is the screenshot I took in ArcMap of the Select by Attribute tool. So I created some queries that would select out certain attributes that we were looking at. So this particular query looks at sites that have infrastructure present, are either parks, municipally owned, or roadways, and they're failing. So those were our highest priority sites that we chose. I think well, I'll get more into how many sites there were, but then we also did we made a few other queries that I'll talk about in a second.
Can I ask a quick question? As far as how you were categorizing the structures as being failing, I mean, were you considering structures that were still functional but were in very poor condition, or were you also looking at structures where places where there had been structures or there were remnant structures but it was not currently functional? Were you still considering that to be an existing structure on the shoreline?
That's a good question. I think most of the sites that we classified as failing, I mean, they were still usable sites. We went back and forth with the wording of like failing, maintenance required, and pristine, because obviously even a site that's pristine is a strong word to use. So we had to make it sort of a broad 3 categories. But there were sites that had like remnants of industrial uses and like had a bulkhead there. I don't know if we came into any sites that it had like an industrial use and the bulkhead was failing, because it's still in use, so they were, you know, they were keeping up with the maintenance of it. So most of the sites that we looked at that were failing didn't have a use associated with them that would like inhibit it from being used. But I know that is kind of confusing that we use like a pretty strong word for each of the categories: failing, pristine, maintenance required. I hope that answers your question, sort of.
Well, I think the way we identified failing was that it was no longer serving the purpose of stabilizing the shoreline. So, but that alone would not create a priority site. It would have to be failing combined with some sort of physical asset on the back side of that would be in jeopardy if it was let to fail. So we're making at that point deciding this is a place that's likely to need some sort of restabilization in the near future because someone's got some sort of asset that they're trying to protect.
So the total number of sites that we looked at was 211. And I should probably comment that we on our map, we had lines that indicated, you can see here on the screen actually, the orange lines indicate where the hardened shoreline was or is. And when we would get to a site that was hardened, we would take multiple points if there was a different shoreline treatment. So if there was revetment adjacent to a bulkhead, we would take 2 different points and 2 different pictures there to represent both shoreline types. Our highest scoring sites, there were 7 of those, and then the next category, there was 25. So the difference between those was the 7 sites were failing, and the 25 sites were maintenance required. Otherwise, they had infrastructure present, and they were the same 3 uses that I mentioned earlier. And then this screenshot just shows that you can see the dots there where we collected some information, and then when you click on that in ArcMap, the picture pops up of that site, so you can get a better idea of what it looks like. And then the rest of the information that we collected, we're considering that site descriptive data. So when it comes down to when we choose a site and we're just looking more at other elements of the site to help us choose a design or just look at the site a little bit closer, we can look at some of the other information like presence of vegetation, distance to channel, to look at what the energy is like at that particular site. So that's what we'll use that for. And then the next steps for this project, we're going to go out again in the spring to just double check some of the measurements that we collected and just make sure that our data is accurate. And then when we are ready, we'll reach out to some of the shoreline owners of the priority sites to try and get an idea of you know, working together with them to do a demonstration project at some of those particular sites. And then if we ever in the future want to revise our criteria for prioritizing, we can always go back and do that by just creating a query with different attributes than we use. So that would be the next step for that. And that's it. If anybody has any questions, I think they can type them into the chat. Or
Yes, please type your questions into the chat. You also can raise your hand and I can call on you because you are unmuted. Rachel, did you have a question? Rachel Villa?
No, that was early on when I couldn't hear. Can you hear me?
Yes, now.
Thank you. I'm good.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I don't see any questions right now. So I think we'll go ahead because I'm having a little trouble because I can't figure out if Stuart is on the call, and he is next. So Stuart, can you answer me? All right, we have a lot of people that really wanted to hear from Stuart, and I'm trying to reach him by email and by phone. So I apologize for that, but I would like to go ahead and have Ido speak then. And I also wanted to give, before Ido speaks, I wanted to give a shout out to the Ohio Coastal Program and to let them know that we have popcorn. I'm going to take this. All right. So Ido Stella is going to talk to us about EcoConcrete, which he developed, and also just on the research around it. So Ido, can you go ahead? You are in control. You can forward your own slides.
Thank you, Emily. I hope you hear me good. Thank you, everyone. First of all, I would like to start to say that I'm a part of this, and it was developed together with my co-founder, Shivit Sinka, and what I'm going to show is a joint work that we're doing basically in Europe, in U.S. Mainly. We're based in Israel, where research and development has started and is now also developing, but most of the work that we do is abroad. And I'm going to talk in particular on what we did until now in the New York, New Jersey region. So as all of you know, we're facing, if we're looking at waterfronts worldwide, and we see the same problems in New York and in Hong Kong and in the waterfronts of Monaco on the Mediterranean, where we have highly urbanized area just on a very productive zones. And those are the coastal zones, where the places where we have photosynthesis and oxygen, and usually we see more biodiversity on a balanced environment, but that's not the case on urbanized waterfronts or working waterfronts worldwide. And if 60% of the world population is sitting on urbanized coastline, and they need different infrastructure, and those infrastructure are usually hard vertical surfaces, and are what we can see worldwide is that 70% of coastal infrastructure are concrete-based. And that's the reason we're focusing in the last 5 or 6 years on concrete structures, because concrete is a poor substrate for biological recruitment. And the reason is that it creates a habitat that is usually don't promote biodiversity, lack ecological niches, have issues with surface chemistry, starting from a pH, but now we're starting to understand that it's not the pH alone. pH is a factor, but a lot of other chemicals that are involved in the concrete, especially for marine construction, affect the biology that develop on it. And we usually see on concrete surfaces two distinct communities. So in tropical environment, in oligotropic environment, we usually see that there's not a lot of recruitment on concrete. This is, for example, what we see on the concrete cube on the left side, on the right side. And this is from the Red Sea, one of the most biodiverse environments in the world. And you can see that there's only a few species of corals that manage to inhabit this concrete cube, which is more than 20 years in the water. And this is usually what we see, similar to things that we see also in the Caribbean. On the other hand, we see concrete surfaces in other areas that are completely covered by biology, but it's usually invasive species, and like the zebra mussels or different oysters and mussels in different areas in the world. And the reason is, or tunicates. And the reason is that the reason for that is that there's no competition. So if local species cannot address this substrate, then invasive species can flourish and use them. And I'm going to discuss this later a bit more. What we are go ahead. I'll proceed. We're trying to create kind of a win-win situation. So we can actually harness concrete surfaces to provide ecosystem services, and I'm going to run really quickly on how we did it and the research and development we did and some of the projects we did until now. So the idea behind the technology is that if we modify the composition of concrete surfaces, but still get them in line with the requirements for marine construction, modifying the texture from the few millimeters and up to the microns of the surfaces, and also incorporating design, we can actually get enhanced ecosystem services, open the substrate for competition, and get more biodiversity, which also reflect on what we call bioprotection. And there's benefits of stability, durability, and reducing maintenance. The evaluation study was done in tropical environment and temperate environment. We did testing in situ and in vitro, which mean there were tests that were run for 2 years underwater in different sites that I'll show you in a minute. And the same sites we also did lab experiments on larvae. Those are the sites where the project was, where the experiment was running for 2 years. It's on the Red Sea, in Eilat, in the Israeli coast, and in the Mediterranean coast of Israel. We had a station at Key West, a station at Savannah, Georgia, a few stations around New York, and one in the freshwater of in the Great Lakes in Alpena, Michigan. And in all those areas, we actually sampled or collected larvae from the water column, different methods, and then settled them in the lab on concrete cubes, as you see on the upper part. And we run same mixes was also in the water, and we evaluate the biofouling and the developing biology for 2 years, every 3 months. And I'll start with what we, I'm giving the general findings because everything is published and can be found in the literature. But what we saw is something that is already known, that texture surfaces recruited much better than smooth surfaces. We saw more biodiversity, more biomass, and a lot of biogenic buildup, different accumulations of calcium carbonate on the surface. Again, those are, for example, results of larvae settlements in the tropical and temperate environment. In this case, 2 species of corals and 1 species of bryozoans, where they're introduced to different concrete matrices, and we evaluate their ability to settle and to colonize the substrate. And you can see that P is representing the Portland cement-based mix, which is like what we call the gray concrete, which is widely used in the industry, and M4 to M1 are representing modified mixes. And now when I'm zooming into New York, New Jersey, this is the same experiment that was run with oyster spat on the same concrete mixes at Governor's Island at the Harbor School. And what we saw that we identified two mixes, M4 and M1, that recruit oyster spat better than others, and especially better than Portland. And we actually utilized M4 and M1 for a project we did at Brooklyn Bridge Park that I'm going to talk shortly. But before that, the first large project that we did was a portion of a breakwater in Israel, where we it's a concrete built breakwater that you see on the lower right side, and we actually replaced the anti-fair unit, that was a concrete blocks, with a modify unit, and we monitored that for 3 years now, publishing the results. We put a lot of emphasis of actually monitoring the site, and this is, I think, one of my most important take-home message, that you can do a lot of different methods and modify waterfront, but if you're not evaluating performance, then it's a bit hard to decide what will be the best method to go forward. And we see a lack in monitoring in a lot of projects, so we try to do as much as we can regarding monitoring sites. And the same was done for seawall replacement. And now I'm zooming in on how we implemented this technology on New York, and we actually did 2 projects within Brooklyn Bridge Park. One was at Pier 6, which was ecological pile encasement, and the other one is a riprap enhancement using water retaining elements, tide pools at Pier 4. Again, it was also the results of 2 years monitoring was already published. And I'll start with the pile encasement. So those some images from the pile. This is the reason that pile encasement is needed in New York is because marine bores are eating into the wooden pile, and there is a need to create a load-bearing structure, which is with the industry is actually encapsulating the concrete, the wooden pile with a form made of fiberglass, and then pumping concrete. And this is what you can see on the right side of the standard, the gray methods. What we did is we created a form that can be used by divers, because pumping is done underwater, as you see here on the lower, and can be stripped easily. So what we expose is a concrete surface, and we're not leaving the fiberglass space on the piles. And again, though, this is already published, but what you can see here are some results of 14 months post-deployment. You can see the control. The control is fiberglass form, and in the middle is the EcoConcrete jacket. And we saw increase in biodiversity. We saw increase in biodiversity, we saw as the biodiversity went up, the ratio between invasive and local species is changing. So there's more local species and less invasive species because there's competition on substrate. We also saw an increase in fish around the structures and with crab. What is really interesting that we dived there a month ago, and we saw on the jackets natural recruitment of oysters. And we still didn't publish this, but it's on the way. The other project that we did in Brooklyn Bridge Park was introducing water retaining elements into a riprap design. And those are the titles that we're using and developed. So the idea was enhancing the ecosystem services of the riprap, and doing that by incorporating water retaining elements that can be a part of the riprap and actually don't affect its stability. And those concrete units have a great success. We did the installation at the same time at different sites in Israel and just by accident in Israel and New York. And it was interesting to see that in completely different environments, we got the same succession on processes. The idea was to create a diverse habitat and nursing ground, create a source for food and shelter, see how we can contribute to water quality. And by saying contribution to water quality is checking and assessing the biomass and the biodiversity of sessile filter organisms. And with doing all those things without affecting the structural performance and integrity of the structure, which is really important in order to integrate ecological design into waterfront. You need to make sure that the engineers are pleased and you don't affect any performance of the structure. What we found is that very fast, three months after deployment, we're starting to see a peak of live cover on the tide pools. The control area was rocks around them, around the area of the tide pools, and also on just below the area. So we have also a lower intertidal area as a control. And there was a huge difference in the amount of biology that we found in the tide pool and around them in comparison to the control. And it was straightforward because as you retain water and there are oxygides and are apart from the effects of the water column, of the massive water column for part of the day, that's usually where we see more biodiversity in different habitats and environments around the world. Again, we saw algae and copypods, amphipods, isopods, tube worms, polychaete worms, and a lot of bryozoans. And during the spring, we're starting to see also post-larva fish. It was hard to identifying them, but we see that the tide pools are utilized as in post-larvae. And I think the conclusion of this is that even in a waterfront like New York, New Jersey, a highly populated waterfront, you can actually promote ecology and biodiversity. You can get ecosystem services, and even on hard coastal structures, even on vertical or concrete-based structures. And there is a method to do that, and I think the science now is developing quite extensively in the last 5 years of supporting this. Just summing up with a note, our designs were incorporated in the group that were involved, was running into through the Rebuild by Design process. And this project was chosen to be funded by federal funding and is now in the making. And a part of it is armor units that I showed previously. The armor units that were incorporated into the Rebuild by Design process are actually the second generation of the armor units. And those are armor units that have the ability to provide different ecological niches. So it's from habitats for fish, and like what you see on the left side with the net, to discs that can be seeded with oyster spat and incorporated into the armor units. So the armor units can actually get a start of biomass and diversity of, start with the spatted seeded oysters. And I think just the conclusion. So there is a way of bringing coastal infrastructure and bringing life and biodiversity. It's really important that we can harness those infrastructure to provide biological processes and ecosystem services. And there is a benefits that need to be addressed regarding the biogenic buildup and the bioprotection. As we get sessile organisms and developing communities on substrate, we're actually protecting that. And it's something that needs to be addressed also, again, as us as biologists, but also by engineers, because it's providing benefits to the structure. And I think the most important is that we need to see more regulation and incentive to facilitate this process. And for example, here in New York, the wedge is a very good example. And we can now start to see the same processes in different areas of the world. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ido. Are there any questions in this room for Ido? This is Emily Hauser again. I just want to apologize for all the problems with the sound. And we do have about 8 people here in the room in New Falls, New York. And so now I don't see any questions from anyone out in on the WebEx. But if you have a question, you can just, if anyone has a question, you could just speak up now. Because they're not muted. You're not muted. You should just unmute your private phone and speak up.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Are these, is this concrete site publicly accessible? Like, could we go and visit it? Where it is in the park?
Yeah, so one side is underwater and is under the pier at Pier 6, so it's only accessible by kayaks or by diving. But the other side, Pier 4, with the tide pools is completely accessible, and the tide pools can be seen there and can be walked to.
Okay, and where is that?
In Brooklyn Bridge Park, just the central Pier 4 at Brooklyn Bridge Park.
Okay, thank you.
Ido, this is Kate Boycourt. Nice to see you this morning.
Hi.
In another setting. I have a question for you. Your EcoConcrete actually came up last night in a conversation with some folks about alternatives, and they had a question about cost and local fabrication, and we're curious sort of how is that changing as you scale up? So have you kind of, I think before some of the tide pools were fabricated in Israel. How is that changing, and is cost going down? Maybe you could tell us a little more about cost.
Yeah, so we actually, at the time when we installed that, we did it from Israel, but since then we are not shipping any concrete long distance. Everything's done with local precasters and local manufacturers. They actually, we have a net of licensed precasters, local precasters that know how to use the technology and get the forms and the add mix, the different powders that you add into the concrete mix, and they manufacture everything locally. So we got to a point that in large projects, we're, let's say, up to 1% more expensive than using the standard material. And in small projects, when there is like, you need to mobilize material for a specific small quantity, you can get to up to 7%, but not more than 7% in cost than what we call the gray product.
So I had a question. Does that mean this is commercially available?
Yep. Yeah, commercially available. It's depend on area, but for example, we have a different. We have a licensed factory or provider in Ireland. We have a licensed provider in Seattle, in Washington State. We're now in the process of doing the same here in New York. And even if we don't have a licensed provider, any precaster, local precaster can manufacture. It's just an issue of using our forms and materials, and it can be done also on a project base.
Okay, thank you. I'm calling from Washington State, so that's great.
Are there any other questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ido. And I also wanted to ask anyone that raised their hand to unraise it so that I know that you no longer have a question or an issue. And there was one question on Casey's question about whether the priority sites were public or private, and the answer is that they concentrated specifically on private.
Well, we
public, I'm sorry.
We looked at both private and public land, but ultimately for the prioritization, we focused on public land because that's where we would be most able to do demonstration sites that would be publicly accessible. But for the inventory, we did look at private and public shorelines. Thank you, Casey.
Now, Stuart Munch should be on. He's from the University of Washington. He's going to talk on a Seattle seawall. Stuart, are you, please say hello, because I know you're on the phone.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I was
All
on the whole time. I guess people just couldn't hear me. Okay.
Okay, Stuart, now do you want to, so that we can show the film, do you want me to share my screen or do you want to share your screen?
Why don't we share your screen, and then I could just kind of tell you to advance the slides. Is that what you're thinking?
Okay. All right. So we will do that.
Okay, perfect.
All right, let me see if that's working.
Okay.
Yep. All right. So Stuart now is going to speak on from Seattle, University of Wisconsin.
Okay. Could we go to the next slide, please?
Emily, I think you have to take the presenting ball.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Okay. That makes sense.
All right. Oh.
Okay, yeah, so thank you very much. So I am going to talk today about some work that I did for my PhD with the University of Washington. Just finished that up, so this is sort of hot off the press. And this is work that I did with the Wetland Ecosystem team in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences, and all this work is kind of done with Jeff Cordell and Jason Toft here. So next slide, please. Okay, so sort of the conceptual understanding of nearshore fish habitat in Puget Sound. So the idea here is that shallow areas right next to shore produce a lot of prey. So you notice areas like epibenthic habitats or terrestrial habitats, and then the water column all produce a lot of invertebrates that little fish can eat. And then the next idea is that shallow areas also exclude larger predators, so they're these kind of nursery areas for small fish. And in the case of juvenile salmon, which I'm going to talk a lot about, they use these areas right next to shore as sort of an out-migration corridor, and so they're occurring within just a couple meters of shore. Next slide, please. And so here we are in Puget Sound. On the top left there's an arrow drawn to downtown Seattle. And so all these pictures show sort of what pristine beaches in Puget Sound might look like. You notice there's actual beaches, and you've got sloping substrate heading into a nice intertidal zone there. Next slide, please. But now our shorelines are quite different than what occurred historically. And so a couple of the big changes are that there's a lot of shoreline armoring. For instance, a third of our waterfronts of Puget Sound are armored. And then there's a lot of overwater structures, so things like piers and floating docks. So despite all of those modifications, we know that fish occur in pretty large numbers, and they're feeding next to shore and essentially trying to use these habitats, even though they're highly modified. Next slide, please. So my talk is mostly based on data that we've collected in Elliott Bay, which is the downtown Seattle waterfront. Next slide. And so Elliott Bay is sort of representative of a lot of waterfront cities in that it's this giant center of economic activities like commerce, tourism, recreation, and transportation. And even though there's all those modifications, it provides habitat for fish and crabs. So in particular, there's a lot of salmon, and within those salmon, Chinook salmon are down to about 10% of their historical populations, and they're listed under the Endangered Species Act. And so all these fish and crabs are sort of species that we care about for cultural, ecological, and economic reasons. And so Elliott Bay used to be beaches and mud flats, and basically all of it is now armored. Next slide, please. So what we have is essentially a mosaic of artificial habitats that run along the downtown waterfront. So in a situation like this, it's pointing to a shoreline bit that's armored, and so it's essentially just got concrete instead of an intertidal zone. Next slide, please. And then there's also beaches at parks where you have something that kind of approaches the historical condition of Elliott Bay. It's obviously not the same, but again, kind of approaching what might have occurred historically. Next slide. And then areas underneath piers basically have no natural analog. They're just really dark, deep areas right next to shore. And so the idea here is to sort of figure out what this means for fish, what happens when we create this patchwork of artificial habitats. Next slide, please. The focus of my talk today, again, is on Pacific salmon and the juveniles that are migrating through estuaries. So salmon are anadromous fish. They spawn in freshwater habitats, and then the juveniles swim out through the estuary on their way to marine habitats, and it's when they're in the estuary that they're right next to shorelines, and they're co-occurring with any kind of modifications to the waterfront. Next slide, please. And so in downtown Seattle, we have this opportunity to improve fish habitats. Our seawall was built mostly in the 30s, and then there was an earthquake in 2001 that put the seawall and the waterfront into a state of disrepair. If we had another earthquake, it would have basically devastated the waterfront. And so we needed to replace the waterfront, and so the idea here is, can we identify how nearshore fish habitat is impaired, and then from there, can we infer how to improve that habitat? Next slide, please. And so just to kind of summarize what we've found, so at natural and built beaches, kind of like what I showed you in that conceptual slide, you get a lot of prey production. So prey produced in terrestrial, epibenthic, and water column habitats. And another function of these shallow areas are that as smaller fish grow, they kind of use deeper waters. And the idea here is that those shallowest areas provide the most protection, they exclude predators the most, and so as fish grow larger, they kind of are more willing to be exposed to predators and occur in deeper waters, and the trade-off there is probably that they get to forage in greater spaces. So we call that an ontogenetic habitat shift. And then finally, beaches will also let flatfish and crabs that like to burrow hide from predators as opposed to just a concrete waterfront. And so again, this is at natural beaches and then also beaches that are built into waterfronts right in downtown areas. Next slide, please. And so in along highly modified shorelines, so for instance here, a shoreline that's completely armored, so you have a seawall that's replacing the intertidal zone and then riprap at the base of that seawall. What we see is that prey is no longer available from epibenthic or terrestrial habitats. And then since there's no shallow waters, the smallest individual fish can't select for those shallow areas. And so the small and the big fish are kind of lumped together close to the waterfront. And then in the case of Puget Sound, we get a predator called lingcod that is actually attracted to deep rocky waters. And since we create these deep areas right next to shore, we're kind of aggregating predators right next to the waterfront where they probably wouldn't occur historically. So again, we're removing protective areas and then also probably attracting predators. Next slide, please.
Someone's typing, so could you please mute your phone? Thank you.
Next slide, please. And so then the other big threat, I guess, are overwater structures. And so what we've found is that when we get these gigantic piers along the waterfront, that fish essentially don't occur underneath them. We find crabs underneath them for some reason at high tide, but essentially, basically all of the fish avoid them. Juvenile salmon in particular avoid shaded areas underneath piers. And then when they do occasionally occur underneath there, they're not able to feed. And I think it's the explanation for this, we think, is basically that they can't see. So they can't see predators, they can't see food, and they can't see each other to school together. And so what they do is they swim along the waterfront and they get right next to piers and circle around. It's been reported that they circle around for about 4 to 6 hours at least. And so if we go to the next slide and show that video, just to kind of visualize this, we're right next to the Seattle Aquarium. We're going to drop underwater. You can see there's actually quite a bit of life. There's a lot of algae and kelp, fish, and there's crabs, climbing kelp and jellyfish. And then as we swim underneath the pier, you just see this dramatic loss of biodiversity. So there's really not a whole lot going on underneath piers. Next slide, please. And so when we look at the Seattle waterfront here, next slide, we see, so juvenile salmon have to swim out the Duwamish River and head out to marine waters. And so they're swimming along the shoreline, and then next slide, please. They're encountering this gauntlet of piers. And so if you imagine that they're trying to migrate, and every time they run into a pier, they get delayed for however long, you would think that it's going to have, it's going to delay their out migrations. And so now, next slide, please. Since we know a few things that are impaired about nearshore habitat in downtown Seattle and probably in Puget Sound more generally, the idea here is, can we repair some lost habitat functions since we're reconstructing the waterfront? Next slide, please. So a couple of options that have been piloted on the left, what you can do is you can install basically an artificial intertidal zone. So they call this a habitat bench, and there's one of these installed next to Olympic Sculpture Park in downtown Seattle. And the idea here, again, is that, you know, if you can't put in a beach, you can still put in kind of basically a fake heterogeneous sort of sediment bench there. And that's going to allow for, again, small fish to access those really safe, shallow waters. And it's going to produce more prey in epibenthic waters that fish like to eat. And then on the right there, if you have basically no room to work with, you can still texturize the seawall or whatever kind of armoring you have, and that can, again, it's preliminary data, that can produce more epibenthic prey that fish, again, like to eat. Next slide, please. And then in terms of mitigating negative effects of piers, the idea here is that if you can get light underneath piers, then it's probably going to mitigate the negative effects of shading. And so what they've done is along the entire downtown Seattle waterfront, they've put in a series just kind of glass blocks that run along the waterfront and through piers. And so again, the idea here is that you're creating a continuous area that is not shaded quite as bad as using conventional pier materials. And then that hopefully restores the out-migration function of the waterfront. Next slide, please. So I've just got some close-up pictures here. That's what the light-penetrating surfaces look like. Next slide. This is what they look like from the bottom. And then again, on the right there are textured seawall panels that hopefully produce more fish prey. Next slide. And you can see these are practical. People can walk on them. They're kind of scuffed, I think, to provide traction. And again, just a real kind of getting the best of both worlds. You know, you can't restore a waterfront, but you can make it better for fish while not impairing that waterfront utility for people. Next slide. And then the other cool thing about trying to make habitat better for fish in a downtown area is that you can, you have a lot of educational and outreach opportunities. And so we've got posters and I guess you could call that a panel that are kind of just on display, and I don't know how many people see these, but I imagine it's a lot. So again, great educational opportunities. Next slide. And then these beaches are great for fish, but it's also really good for people. A lot of people like to hang out at places like Olympic Sculpture Park or Myrtle Edwards, those sort of places. So it's kind of, again, getting the best of both worlds. And then on the bottom there is another panel that's along the downtown waterfront that explains the purpose of the work that we did. So again, a lot of educational and sort of, I guess, recreational opportunities that we can also I guess, accomplish or overlap with when we're trying to make habitats better for fish. Next slide, please. And then I kind of just wanted to point out, we did pilot these light penetrating surfaces with a few different materials here. We looked at metal grating, glass panels, and essentially a skylight that they called a solar tube. And so all of those got more light down to the water underneath the piers, as you can imagine. And then they basically went with the glass panel design that's in the middle there and then modified it to what you saw earlier. Next slide, please. And so this is just kind of a conceptual model of how you can restore fish habitat given the constraints of human use. So what we're looking at going from left to right is where you have increasing human use constraints, so areas before and behind the waterfront that you can or can't work with. And so if you have room in front of and behind the waterfront, you can put in beaches like what I showed you before. If you've got no room behind the waterfront, you can still put in artificial intertidal zones like what we have. And then there's also one, I think, in Vancouver. They call it a habitat skirt there. And then if you're moving to the right where the ships are and you essentially have no room to work with, you can still texturize your seawall and hopefully provide more prey for fish. And then looking at the piers, if you have the option, you can minimize the materials that are over water right next to shore, which is where the fish are. You can use fewer pilings. And then moving to the right, if you have to have a giant pier, you can put in like penetrating surfaces to just get more light to the water beneath the pier. Next slide, please. And so the majority of this is already published. The reference at the top there is going to be coming out sometime next year. And so that's probably the one that people are going to be most interested in. But in terms of looking at sort of the negative effects of armoring and overwater structures, all of those papers are listed right there. So I guess with that, I will take any questions, and thanks for listening.
Thank you. Can we take one or two questions while we switch presenters? Go ahead and just shout it out.
This is David Barnett at DC.
Hi.
And I was very, very fascinated by this presentation. And I guess what I wonder about is, do you have any data that actually shows how the biota have responded to these kind of improvements? Is it showing more diversity?
So not yet. The waterfront is half reconstructed right now. And so we're hoping to do some kind of post-monitoring in a couple of years. But there were a couple pilot studies, so textured seawall panels and then that habitat bench. We looked at those on pretty small scales, and this was right before I started grad school, so there's other folks that might be better at talking about this than me. But again, it does seem promising that if you put in texturized seawall panels, you'll get a different prey assemblage. And then if you put in a habitat bench, again, more prey produced, and then fish that can access shallow waters. But no, as far as whole scale, seeing if light penetrating surfaces actually reproduce an out-migration corridor, that sort of thing, we don't have that data yet because it hasn't been collected.
Okay, thank you. Is there one more question? Thank you, Stuart. Now we're going to hear from another bulkhead enhancement project from Dan Miller here in the Hudson Valley. Dan, you should be all set.
Do I advance right here on this? Or
you should advance right.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about pretty much the same thing we've been hearing about. How do you increase the habitat value of some of these built environments, focusing mostly on steel bulkhead in freshwater environments. So it's a slightly different environment with a different set of challenges, but this was our attempt to try to get a little bit more habitat value out of these places. The work started with the inventories that you had heard about earlier from Casey. This work was coupled with some research that was done by Dave Strayer and Stuart Finley as part of the Sustainable Shorelines project that looked at diversity among the shorelines within the Hudson, their habitat values, and what actual physical characteristics about those habitats were connected to the habitat value. Basically, what we found is something that I think most of you probably are familiar with already, is that structural complexity is directly correlated to diversity and productivity within these shorelines. As you saw with what I had talked about earlier about the Hudson having sort of a naturally rocky shoreline, and also the near 30% of the shoreline being riprap associated with the railroad. We've got a lot of that structural complexity in some of those places, and a pretty decent biodiversity, particularly from the fish community along those shorelines. What we also found that goes along with that is that vertical sheet pile, and you can just sort of picture what it looks like in sort of its very simple sort of construction, was the lowest value shoreline in the estuary in terms of biodiversity and fish habitat. So we tried to think about, all right, well, if there's an opportunity to get some lift, maybe not restoring full functional value to something that a natural shoreline would have, but try to raise that very low value to something a little bit better. Let's see what we can do with some of these sheet pile shorelines that exist in the estuary already. Okay. 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 So the site that we chose was Rhinecliff Landing Park in the town of Rhinebeck, which is about river mile 80 to 90 on the Hudson. It's a typical public use site. There's a boat launch there. It's a very popular destination for people to come and look at the rivers and beautiful views out to the west of the Catskill Mountains. The bulkhead itself is active and used by a number of large vessels, and which, that is a use that needed to be maintained. People fish off of this. It is also an Amtrak train station for the line that runs out of New York City and heads to points north. So the idea was to come up with these fish habitat enhancement devices, or fish heads as we call them. The goal was to increase structural complexity and hope that had some sort of repercussions for fish habitat use on the bulkhead itself. Now, we were taking small steps here. We really wanted to prove that we could improve not only use of the area by fish, but also we had to start really basic and prove that we could design, construct, deploy, and retrieve these things. And one of the main constraints that we had in this environment was ice. We really felt strongly that whatever we put in the water here had to come out in the fall and then be replaced in the spring. And that limits some of the benefits that you can get out of these things, especially with the sessile invertebrate community that would maybe settle and develop over many years. When you pull them out of the water, you kind of reset that clock. But as you can see with the picture on the right, we get a tremendous amount of ice that flows in two directions, 6 hours in one direction, 6 hours in the other. And we were very concerned that whatever we put out there could possibly be damaged itself, and so also possibly damage the bulkhead itself. And we always had to try to keep in mind the adoptability of this type of system if we were to go out to other property owners, whether private or public, and suggest that we have this way of improving habitat on their site. We certainly didn't want to put anything out there that would jeopardize their existing bulkhead. So we felt it was an imperative for us to be able to remove these devices. We also needed to allow continued use by large vessels. The Coast Guard ties an icebreaker at this location for their wintertime channel maintenance. So nothing could stick out from the bulkhead. So that really confined where we could work. Within those constraints, again, our idea was to improve habitat or increase structural complexity, and thereby create velocity refuge for finfish, and we'll show you how worked here. So here's the design. We partnered with the folks at the Stevens Institute of Technology down in New Jersey and Feeney Shipyard right across the river, guys who build barges for a living. So we figured they were pretty good working with steel. We came up with this design that included 2 steel bands being welded in a horizontal direction across the bulkhead. And I'm going to zoom in on that by advancing to the next slide. So those 2 is shaped like a big T almost. So those 2 horizontal bands are actually welded to the bulkhead itself. And the idea is that the vertical section is then hung from those bands using 3/4 inch bolts, 4 3/4 inch bolts on each band. And that would allow us to undo them and retrieve it and bring it in for the winter. The bands themselves, of course, stay, but given the fact that they are welded and much smaller than the entire unit itself, we saw that probably wouldn't have much of a problem with the ice with those. Now, the idea behind the design with the way that the bottom portion of T hangs down is that we wanted to avoid the need to weld underwater. Of course, the cost of installation would go through the roof with that. So the concept is that we would come in, we would install these things at low tide. That lower band would be welded at the water line during low tide. And then as we mounted the habitat portion to it, that would dip down and be continuously underwater through the entire tide cycle. Here's just a side view of it. So if you're familiar with corrugated vertical sheet pile, there's sort of a zigzag pattern as you look down on it. So there's a recessed section within the wall, and there was the lower portion that sits below the water actually had sides to it, creating a sort of a box. If you raise chickens and saw a nest box, that's what it kind of looks like, because the front portion of this has some holes that access those recessed portions of the habitat. Fabrication and installation turned out to be a lot more than we had set out to do, but it turned out to be a fairly big job. The shipyard brought a spud barge across the river, complete with a really big crane and some pretty heavy-duty welding equipment. They dropped a small dock in place, and the guys worked on it for every bit of 5 or 6 hours, welding these things to the bulkhead. You can see them in their most pristine condition laying on the lawn there before they were installed. You can see the actual box units that are recessed into the bulkhead. And we also attached what we call eel mops. This is nylon rope that has been frayed into a big nest almost, and then they're tied to the inside of these boxes as an attractant to some small fish and invertebrates, and we've used them elsewhere as traps for small glass eels migrating into the estuary. The first test we had of these is whether or not we could remove the habitat portions and put them back. So a couple weeks later, we went right back out again, and we're running a 21-foot Boston whaler, so it's a fairly sizable boat with a small hand crank davit off the side, and we were able to hook to it, remove the bolts, and go out into the river a bit, run a couple circles, and put it back. These things still do weigh 3/8 inch steel and about 7 feet long, so they do weigh about 300 pounds. So when it comes to actually bringing these to the dock and loading them up on the truck in the winter, we needed at least 5 or 6 people with good backs to move these things around. So we went, along with this, we did some sampling to try to demonstrate whether or not we were having any sort of positive effect on the ecology of the bulkhead. Now, I'll get to some problems with our sampling design and sampling methods, but right off the bat, I think the first day that we were out there sampling, we caught this smallmouth bass, and we thought we really hit the jackpot, but it really wasn't that. That sort of return did not happen for the rest of the project. So we do go out and we fish it a couple times, both in the spring, summer, and fall. And then when we pull them out in the fall, there's a picture here of Dave Strayer taking some scrapings and looking at the sessile invertebrate community. So we'll start with some of the invertebrates at first. This is a list of the invertebrates that were found on all 4 units that were put into place, dominated by Dracaena. That's the zebra mussel. So zebra mussels really like these things. But we also found a number of other native invertebrates, things, as Dave would like to put it, things that fish like to eat. So there were some sort of attractive fauna in there for fish. I'd like to point out that, much of the rest of the bulkhead is treated with anti-fouling compounds, where these were not. So as a surface in itself, it was more attractive to things settling on it. Here's some of the results for the fish. Now, this isn't that encouraging right now, but I do have some things to talk about with the sampling. With the information that we've collected so far, there was no significant increase in the catch between the control sites and the other sheep pile sites. So that's the 2 bars on the left of our catch per unit effort of fish, both in the treated and the untreated section of the bulkhead. Now, a couple of quick things. One is that this is a fairly short piece of bulkhead, and the treated section with the fish heads was 1/2 of that. So there wasn't really any space between them so that one side could not affect the other. So we really don't have that much confidence that fish on one portion of the bulkhead couldn't have been affected by something that was happening on the other side. So difficult to tease that out. Our sample number was quite low. So that one day in the spring when we were in front of the non-fish head site, which is the RHIN, the second bar to the right, we hit the pedals on an electroshocker, and 100 herring came up, and I knew that we just blew our sample, our study at that point, because that was going to really affect the numbers that we got given the small sample size so far. The other thing is that we were fishing using an electroshocker out in front of these units. So really what we're sampling is the area in front of, off the shoreline, in front of the habitats. We're not sampling what's inside the habitats, and that is something that we are yet to be able to figure out how to do. We're considering using cameras and such to see habitat use or fish use within those, but we haven't yet been able to really determine that. So in my opinion, the jury is still out on whether or not there is a slight difference in the improvement and whether or not we can detect that with the sampling methods that we are using. Like I said earlier, we hadn't been able to demonstrate through our sampling methods the use of the habitats themselves by fish, just fish out in front of them. Until this year, just by chance, when we pulled them out this fall, we unhooked them from the bulkhead, we dragged them through about 50 yards of water, lifted them onto the dock, and when we laid them down, in this case, an American eel came spilling out of the backside of the box. So while it may seem insignificant to us, it was at least the first demonstration that there were fish inside of that, and we had a couple of other examples of pumpkin seeds and sunfish came out of the boxes on that day too. So we have evidence of use on the inside. Whether or not that's significant or not at this point remains to be seen. Our next steps, again, are to put it back out this fall. We're going to look for some other sites to possibly put a couple more of these in. We're going to look to enhance those boxes a little bit more, maybe use some more of the eel mop material, or maybe there's some more things we can use within the boxes to make them more attractive and to figure out a more effective way of sampling them. And that's it. That's all I got. Any questions?
Any questions in the room? Dan, what would you want to just explain the presence of the zebra mussels or the people out there?
Okay, well, the zebra mussel is an invasive bivalve imported from Europe. I think it first came into the Hudson during the 1990s. It's a problematic invasive. It has been shown to really sequester much of the forage material, all the plankton and phytoplankton that should be available to higher order fishes is getting caught up in these zebra mussels, kind of affecting in a big way the ecology of the river.
All right. If anyone has a question, you can just ask it. Pretty quiet out there. I do have a...
Emily, this is one quick question. For a person who by training and profession is an urban planner, have you guys formally signed up for APA credits for this?
Yes. So send me my, I'll just send me an email.
Okay, we'll do that. Thank you.
And there was a question.
Hey, Dan.
Go ahead.
I had a question for Dan. This is Russell Urban-Mead. The egg box design, did that kind of come from some concept other than chicken coops, or was there some other science behind that size and concept? And I guess my second question was, it looks pretty robust. Have you considered leaving one or two of them out for the winter and see if they'd hold up?
Well, certainly we would have got away with it last winter because we had very little ice. We have considered it, but it's not a risk we want to take with somebody else's bulkhead at this point. I've seen the ice do some really extraordinary damage to built structures on the Hudson. Things that look far more robust than that have been. I've seen dolphins pushed over by the ice that were sunk, really deep into the water. As far as the inspiration or the science behind the construction, we were just looking for a way to create a refuge. These sites are very exposed. You've got a strong tide going in both directions, and given the values of these really rough surfaces with a lot of interstitial space that Stuart and Dave were able to identify. We were simply trying to replicate that in some way. Clearly, we weren't going to put a big pile of rocks in front of it, so was it inspired by chicken boxes? Well, I guess in some sense it was, but there weren't really that many other alternatives that we could see, but hopefully we'll discover more.
I wonder if someone scubaing past them during the growing season would have seen a lot back there that is hard to appreciate once you kind of pull it up and it's just dry on the dock.
Right, and that's probably what we're trying to solve over this winter. We're going to try to get some sort of either acoustic or visual camera system to help us quantify the fish coming and going from these things.
That makes sense to me, and I agree with you. It's a very popular spot. I love to sit there myself.
Thank you, Russell. I have I wanted to thank all the presenters. We are at 3:30. There were a few questions in the chat box, but we can get back to you personally. And again, I wanted to remind you that the next webinar is January 20th at 2 o'clock, 2 hours after inauguration, and that will be on the wedge waterfront edge design guidelines with Kate Boykar in New York City. So that should be really interesting. And we do record this, and you can watch it again and also get the presentations as soon as we can get them up. So check next week for those engineers and landscape